blood trail led straight to his water well. Tobias Hartwell had seen enough wounded animals in his 38 years on this godforsaken ranch to know the difference between deer blood and something much worse. But as he followed the dark red droplets past the edge of his barn, what met his eyes made his grip on the rifle falter. A young native warrior lay collapsed beside the stone base of the well, one hand desperately clutching a seeping wound in his torso, the other barely extended toward the wooden bucket dangling just inches above. His breaths came in ragged gasps, each one sharp and shallow, and though his eyes were hazy with agony, they locked onto Tobias with the fierce clarity of someone who had survived more danger than most. It was 1847, a time when seeing an Indian on your land usually meant disaster, the kind of trouble that ended with a man slaughtered in his bed or torched inside his own cabin. Any rancher within a day's ride would tell Tobias the same thing: pull the trigger, bury the body, and never speak of it again. Tobias lifted his rifle, finger poised above the trigger, the rational choice, the expected choice. But then he saw it, something in the warrior's eyes that stopped him cold. Not just the pain of a wound, but a raw thirst that Tobias remembered too well from the drought of 43, when he'd gone 4 days without a drop and thought he wouldn't live to see the 5th. A thirst that was unmistakably human. The warrior tried to speak, his lips cracked and torn, but all he managed was a breathless whisper. Water. Tobias lowered his gun and reached for the bucket. His neighbors would say he was insane. His cousins back in New York would chalk it up to prairie madness, and maybe they'd be right. But as he crouched beside this bleeding stranger and raised the pail to his mouth, watching him drink like a soul pulled from the edge of death, Tobias knew one thing without question. He was about to upend everything. What Tobias couldn't have imagined was that this warrior wasn't just any tribesman, and what would follow would bring more riders down his dusty trail than he'd ever seen in a lifetime of living out here. The Indian drank with the desperation of someone who hadn't tasted water in nearly a week. 3 full buckets passed his lips before he could lift the 4th with his own shaking hands. Tobias studied every swallow, heart thundering, aware of the weight of his choice in this harsh land. Sparing an Indian meant risking everything. Yet as color began to return to the man's face, Tobias noticed something that sent ice down his spine. The injury wasn't the result of a wild animal or a misfire. It was a gunshot wound, new, bleeding freely, and from the way the skin around it was charred with powder, he'd been shot point blank. Recent close range, which meant whoever fired the shot might still be tracking him, following that same bloody trail leading straight to Tobias Hartwell's front yard, maybe already on their way, rifles loaded and ready to spill more blood. The warrior must have read the shift in Tobias's expression, because with trembling effort, he lifted his hand and gestured toward the horizon, then drew his finger slowly across his own throat. The warning couldn't have been clearer. Death was coming. Fast, Tobias's chest tightened like a vice. Every survival instinct screamed for him to drag the wounded man off his land, erase every trace, and pretend none of this ever happened. But the warrior could barely lift his head. Moving him now would finish the job the bullet had started, and leaving him, there was like painting a bullseye on both of them. Then came the sound Tobias had learned never to ignore in over a decade of hard living out here. Hooves. Not 1 or 2, but several, pounding hard and fast, cutting through the silence like thunder before a storm. The warrior heard it too. His eyes widened in alarm, and he struggled to push himself tighter against the stone well, as if pressing into the shadows could make him disappear. Blood oozed through his fingers, staining the ground again. Tobias snatched the empty bucket and splashed it over the blood trail, trying to blur the evidence. But he couldn't erase it all, not in time. The riders were coming fast, less than a minute out now, the earth itself seeming to pulse with each strike of their horses. Tobias looked down at the man who'd collapsed into his world with nothing but a dying breath and a need for water. A man who could get them both killed. But in the warrior's eyes, he saw something that made his breath catch. Not fear, not desperation, gratitude, pure and unmistakable. And in that fleeting moment, Tobias knew what he had to do. He couldn't carry him, but if they moved fast enough, They might reach the old root cellar behind the barn. He bent down to lift him, but before Tobias could help, the warrior grabbed his wrist with startling strength and slowly shook his head. Then came the moment that sent ice through Tobias's veins. The warrior smiled, not in relief, but like someone who already knew what was cresting that distant ridge. That smile wasn't for safety, it was for understanding. The riders appeared like a thunderhead, dark and swift, kicking up a cloud of dust as they crested the hill. 6 men on horseback, rifles slung low, eyes sharp. Tobias spotted the one in front instantly. Marshal Dixon Webb, a name whispered in every saloon and jailhouse from here to the Mexican border. A man who believed justice came from a barrel, who shot before he spoke and called it law. The kind who'd torch a ranch to the ground for harboring the wrong man and hang the owner as a warning. Tobias stepped in front of the well, planting himself between the warrior and what was coming, trying to look like just another rancher mending fence posts on a dry afternoon. His mouth was dry as dust. Webb pulled his horse to a stop just yards away, close enough that Tobias could see the sun glint off the star pinned to his chest and the ice in his eyes. The other 5 men spread out wide in a deliberate arc, their fingers brushing against holsters, eyes scanning like wolves on a scent. This wasn't a neighborly visit. "Evening, Hartwell," Webb said, his voice smooth and lazy like someone who always came out on top. "We are tracking an injured Apache. Trail of blood led straight here." Tobias felt sweat prickling his scalp, despite the chill that had settled over the land. "Ain't seen a soul, Marshal," he said, keeping his voice calm. "Been fixing the eastern fence since sunup." Webb's pale eyes swept the property slowly, dissecting every shadow, every disturbed patch of dirt. He didn't miss a thing. His attention to detail was the reason people feared him more than the criminals he hunted. His gaze paused just long enough on the reddish smudge near the well to make Tobias' chest tighten. "Is that so?" Webb said, stepping down from his horse with slow, practiced ease. "Because that sure as hell looks like blood, still wet. And unless you've started butchering hogs next to your well water, I'd say someone's bleeding not far from where you're standing." Behind Tobias, hidden by the stone base of the well, the wounded Apache hadn't moved a muscle, but the weight of his silence was deafening. One cough, one groan, one breath too loud, and it would all be over. Webb advanced 3 more steps, his palm resting heavily on his sidearm now, fingers twitching just slightly. "You know the punishment for sheltering one of their kind, right, Hartwell? Same as siding with an enemy during wartime." Hanging tree, quick drop, sudden stop. The words lingered like a noose tightening around Tobias' neck. Every nerve in his body screamed to act, but he was frozen, knowing that any movement would draw the lawman's attention to what he was protecting. Then impossibly the Apache spoke, not in English, but in his native tongue, words rich with power, cutting through the air like the first strike of thunder before a storm. Webb stopped mid-step. His face went pale. The confidence drained from his features as if someone had pulled the life right out of him. His hand fell from the gun like it suddenly weighed 100 pounds. He opened his mouth, closed it, then finally managed a hoarse, almost reverent whisper. "Good Lord, it's him." The other riders, who just moments earlier had been poised for confrontation, swung down from their horses in near unison. Guns forgotten, faces tight with disbelief, but it wasn't fear of an enemy. It was the fear of men realizing they'd nearly crossed an irreversible line. Webb turned to Tobias, his expression stripped of every ounce of bravado. "Do you have any idea who you've been helping?" Tobias blinked, struggling to piece together what he was seeing. In all his years out here, he'd never once seen Webb flinch, not at wolves, wildfires, or war parties, but now the man looked as if he'd seen death itself. The Apache spoke again, this time in English, each word calm, confident, and unwavering. "Tell him who I am, Marshal. Tell him what drove you to ride like hell to catch me." Webb swallowed visibly, throat bobbing. "This is Hyana, son of Chief Dakota, leader of the Northern Apache," he stammered. "He's the one who negotiated peace with Fort Richardson this past spring." Tobias felt the world tilt on its axis. That treaty, everyone in the territory owed their lives to it. It had ended nearly 4 years of bloodshed, halted ambushes, and gave settlers a chance to build something permanent without fear of fire or arrows in the dark. And the man bleeding out beside his well was the very architect of that fragile truce. But if Ayana was the one who forged peace, why was there a bullet in his side? And why was the law trying to hunt him? There was an ambush, Ayana said, each breath still heavy, but his voice gaining strength as the weight of truth gave it power. 3 nights back, I was supposed to meet with Colonel Morrison to discuss broadening the treaty into the southern lands. But Morrison never intended to walk away from that meeting alive. Webb's complexion shifted from ashen to stone-cold grey. Colonel Morrison is dead, he said stiffly, shot in the back during an attack blamed on your people. That's what they want you to believe, Yana replied, pushing himself higher against the stone, defiant even in pain. But Morrison wasn't gunned down by Apache. He was murdered by men in fake war paint, speaking broken phrases of our language. Just enough to fool witnesses. They knew the time, the place. They made sure the blame would fall on me. Tobias felt like the wind had been knocked from his lungs. It wasn't just a setup. It was a calculated attempt to reignite war. Someone had orchestrated the assassination to make Hannah look guilty, someone who profited from chaos. Webb asked the question with a voice already laced with suspicion. Hannah's eyes went cold and sharp, like blades honed by loss. The same ones selling weapons to the rogue bands, the ones getting rich from bloodshed, the ones who sent you here not for justice, but to silence me. Webb stepped back, his hand drifting toward his holster out of instinct, then pausing Medea. That's a serious claim. You're accusing powerful people of betrayal, of treason. It's not treason if no one knows about it, Hannah said grimly. That's why they tried to end me before I can reach the Apache Council. That's why they left me bleeding in the dirt. That's why they hoped you'd pull the trigger and bury the truth with my body. Tobias felt like he was watching a fuse burn toward a powder keg. What had begun as a simple act of mercy had dropped him in the center of a political wildfire. And if Anna's words were true, then Marshal Webb hadn't ridden here to bring in a criminal. He'd come to finish a cover-up. The silence that followed was thick, stretched tight as a drawn bowstring. Webb's men shifted anxiously in their saddles, hands near their rifles, eyes flicking between their commander and the bloodied man, now accusing half the territory's leadership of conspiracy and murder. Tobias could almost hear the gears grinding in Webb's head, the lawman torn between allegiance to his badge and the truth unraveling before him. Men like Webb didn't wrestle with conscience. They shot it. Even if what you're saying holds water, he said slowly, like walking across thin ice, I've got my orders. You're wanted for Morrison's death. I was sent to bring you back, dead or alive. And dead is easier, Hannah said without blinking. Because corpses don't speak. Corpses don't expose the men who profit from another war. One of Webb's deputies, a younger man with wide, anxious eyes, leaned forward in his saddle, voice cracking with hesitation. Marshal, if this is true, if the treaty was real, enough, Bradley, Webb barked. But Tobias didn't miss the fracture spreading across his stone-hard facade. That's when Hannah reached for the final piece he hadn't yet revealed. From a weathered leather pouch tied at his waist, he withdrew a blood-spotted envelope, his fingers trembling but determined. This is what they wanted to bury with me, he said, holding it out. A letter from Colonel Morrison, written the night before he died. Webb stared at it as though it might ignite in his hands. Tobias held his breath. What's in it? It says Morrison uncovered the names of those running guns to the rebel tribes. Dates, deals, payments. More than enough to send a dozen men swinging from the gallows, Hannah said, eyes locked onto Webb with unflinching clarity. Even named someone inside the marshal's own office. Someone on the take. Someone paid to keep their mouth shut. The words struck Webb like a slap, his face draining of color until it settled into a shade that looked more corpse than man. Behind him, his deputies shifted awkwardly, suddenly preoccupied with reins and saddle straps, anything to avoid meeting his eyes. Tobias could barely hear over the roar of his own heartbeat. This wasn't just a man being accused. It was a man watching his entire world unravel. You're bluffing, Webb said, but the hesitation in his voice told another story. Am I? Yana asked, lifting the blood-marked letter in one trembling hand. Morrison gave this to me himself, hours before they ambushed him, told me to take it to Fort Richardson if anything went wrong, said it was his last insurance policy. Webb stepped closer, one hand tightening around his sidearm. Hand that over, he growled, before you get everyone here killed. So you can burn it, Yana said with quiet finality. I don't think so, Marshal, but I'll offer you something better. Let me make it to the council tomorrow, and I'll leave your name out of it when the truth comes out. The offer lingered in the stillness like smoke curling from a fresh bullet hole. Tobias watched as Webb's eyes darted, calculating, weighing whether survival was worth swallowing pride. And then, unexpectedly, young Deputy Bradley stepped down from his horse and walked toward the well, hands up in a show of peace. Marshal, he said slowly, I've been remembering something. That crate of rifles we were told went missing back in April, the one blamed on a raid. Webb turned, jaw tightening. What about it? I saw those exact rifles again 2 weeks later, Bradley continued, voice cracking slightly, in the hands of settlers headed toward the Riverlands. The same serial marks, and I started wondering who's actually robbing who. A hush fell over the group. The spell broke. One by one, the other deputies looked up, trading silent realizations, pieces clicking together, things they'd seen, overheard, doubted, but never dared question. Tobias saw it then. Yana had just cracked the foundation with nothing but the truth and conviction. He hadn't lifted a weapon, yet he'd begun to turn the tide. But men like Webb didn't yield easily, especially not when cornered. If you're enjoying this tale of Western grit, the voice of a future narrator might say, stick around, because what comes next will change everything. Justice, as these men thought they knew it, was about to meet the truth head-on. Webb's fingers clenched around his pistol, knuckles white with fury. A desperate man with nothing to lose was the most lethal kind, and Tobias saw it all unfolding. The shift, the surrender to rage, the final descent. Idiots, Webb spat, his face contorted with venom, all pretense of civility gone. You really believe this savage's lies? You think anyone will take the word of a dying Apache and a bunch of green deputies over mine? The deputies spread out instinctively, hands inching toward their belts, but doubt clouded their eyes. The balance had shifted, and Webb could feel it slipping beyond his reach. Years spent obeying commands didn't shield a man from the moment he realized those commands might have always been wrong. Yana braced himself against the stone well, dragging his body upright with sheer will. Blood still pulsed from his side, soaking into his shirt, but his voice was firm, unwavering. The truth doesn't care who delivers it, Marshal. It stands on its own. Webb's jaw clenched. Truth is, you assassinated a U.S. Army officer, and there's a reward on your head I intend to collect. His gun came out in a flash, the muzzle swinging toward Yana like a judge's gavel. But before the shot could ring out, Deputy Bradley stepped into the line of fire, revolver drawn and eyes hard. Put it down, Marshal. His voice hit the air like a thunderclap. Around them, the 4 other deputies lifted their weapons too, aimed not at the fugitive, but at their own superior. Only one man held his ground beside Webb, a hardened brute named Hawkins, who looked like he'd crawled out of the same mud pit of corruption as his boss. Webb's voice lost its steel, replaced by a nervous sweat. You boys don't know what you're doing. This will ruin you. You'll lose your stars, maybe your necks. Maybe, Bradley replied, not lowering his aim. But I've followed enough bad orders to know this is where it stops. Tobias watched the standoff with a sick weight in his gut. Half a dozen men pointing guns at each other, all convinced righteousness was on their side. This was how massacres began. How honor got buried in shallow grave. Then Yana did something none of them expected. He began to sing. Not in English, but in the language of his ancestors, a low, echoing chant that rose like smoke, carrying sorrow and strength in every syllable. The sound wasn't loud, but it filled the ranch like a rising wind through canyon stone, telling a story no one could translate, but everyone could feel. A song of loyalty, loss, and brotherhood. The effect was instant. The deputies, one by one, eased their weapons down, spellbound. Even Webb hesitated, eyes narrowing in confusion. But Hyana wasn't just singing, he was calling. Tobias felt it in his bones. This wasn't a farewell tune, it was a summons. A signal only his people would recognize, carried by the dusk. The melody ended. Silence followed, deep and eerie. And then, faint but unmistakable, came the sound that shattered it all. Hoofbeats fast and many, pounding like a second heartbeat beneath their feet. Webb heard it too. His complexion turned to chalk. "How many?" he whispered. Yana, despite the pain etched in his features, smiled. "Enough." The noise grew like a storm rolling in, dozens of horses tearing across the plains. Not 6 men this time, not even 20. A full Apache war party was approaching fast, and they'd reached the ranch within minutes. Webb's panic twisted into rage. He turned his pistol, now aiming it straight at Tobias. "You brought this on us, you let him call them." Tobias didn't flinch. "I gave a man water," he said, calm as the still before lightning, "same as I do for any living souls suffering on my land." The ground trembled beneath them as the hoofbeats neared, too many to count, too close to stop. And in that instant, Webb realized what Yana had orchestrated all along. They crested the ridge like warriors from another time. 50 Apache riders painted in fierce colors, riding with unity and silent purpose, their faces hard as stone and glowing in the gold of sunset. But as they drew nearer, Tobias saw something that shattered every assumption he'd ever held. These men weren't riding for war. At the front of the formation rode an elder whose mere presence carried the weight of generations. His hair, streaked with silver and laced with eagle feathers, framed a face weathered by wind, war, and wisdom. Though age had left its marks, he sat tall in the saddle, the very image of a man who had never bent to another's will. Behind him followed warriors spanning lifetimes, scarred veterans and fresh-faced youths barely old enough to grip a blade. Yet none of their weapons were drawn. Webb's expression shifted violently, confusion, fear, calculation, all flickering in his eyes as his shaking hand kept the pistol aimed at Tobias. "This doesn't change a thing," he muttered. "I still have my orders." "Those orders," came a voice from the side, calm but firm, "are no longer in effect." All heads turned as Deputy Bradley stepped forward, holding a stamped document high. "This came in today, Marshal, direct from the territorial governor. Pursuit of Ayana has been suspended. There's an investigation into Morrison's death." Webb turned a shade darker, his rage bubbling over. "You lying." "Check your own dispatch bag," Bradley cut in, "unless you've been too busy chasing bounty money to read what you're paid to enforce." Around them, the Apache riders had encircled the homestead. Not in threat, but with a presence that could not be ignored. The chief slid from his horse with deliberate grace, walking toward the stone well where Yana stood, battered but upright. The old man's eyes scanned his son with deep worry, his hands moving over the wound, speaking words in Apache thick with paternal urgency. Yana replied in their native tongue, mixing in just enough English that Tobias grasped fragments. Evidence, betrayal, the names behind it all. When their exchange ended, the elder turned, fixing his gaze on Webb. His voice, when it came, was crisp, accent-free, and edged with controlled fury. "Marshal Webb," he said, "my son tells me you came here to kill him." Webb's grip faltered. "I came to arrest a wanted man." "A man falsely accused," the chief replied coldly. "His only crime was uncovering how you and your allies have built fortunes from keeping our peoples at war." The words lingered like smoke over a battlefield. Hawkins, Webb's last loyal deputy, began inching his horse backward, clearly weighing whether retreat was still an option. "You have no proof," Webb snapped, but his voice cracked under the weight of the lie. The chief's smile was sharp, not warm, a warrior's smile before the final blow. "We have Morrison's letter. We have the dying confessions of the ones truly responsible." And more than that, he nodded to a warrior who rode forward, carrying a thick leather pouch. The man retrieved a bundle of documents, edges curled with use, and held them high. "Your own letters, Marshal. Every deal, every shipment, every coin passed under the table. Morrison tracked it all before you even knew he was watching." As the pages changed hands, Webb's face drained of blood, as if the lies themselves had come back to devour him. And in that instant, Tobias saw it, the unraveling, a man who had clawed his way to power through betrayal and violence, now realizing it had all been for nothing but a final, inescapable fall. The evidence was undeniable, the testimony strong, and the consequences inescapable. But desperate men rarely go quietly. With the recklessness of a cornered predator, Webb snapped his pistol toward the chief, eyes wild with panic. "If I'm going down, I'm taking you with me," he growled. What followed happened faster than breath. Yana lunged between his father and the barrel, wounded but fearless. And before the shot could find its mark, Tobias Hartwell, a rancher, with no stake in any of this, hurled himself into Webb from behind, knocking them both into the dust in a chaotic blur of limbs and fury. The gun discharged harmlessly into the sky. Silence followed, thick and final, as the dust began to settle. Webb lay stunned beneath Tobias, his weapon flung across the yard. Within moments, Bradley and the others moved in, disarming and restraining both Webb and Hawkins. Around them, the Apache warriors gradually lowered their weapons, their eyes never leaving the scene. But what stayed in Tobias' memory long after the day ended was what happened next. The chief approached slowly, his face unreadable, his footsteps deliberate. He stopped before Tobias, who sat breathless on the ground, and placed both hands on his shoulders. He spoke in Apache, the words ancient and filled with gravity. Ayana translated, his voice thick with emotion. He says, "You are now our brother, that your choice to show mercy, to defend truth, to act with courage instead of fear, makes you a true warrior." Tobias felt something deep within shift, like a weight he hadn't known he carried being lifted. All his life he'd been told who the enemy was. But now, staring into the eyes of this elder, he saw only honor and a kind of acceptance he'd never received from his own kind. What followed was a ceremony unlike anything he'd ever seen. The warriors dismounted and gathered in a wide circle, approaching one by one to place a hand on Tobias. A gesture of kinship that didn't require words. When the final warrior stepped back, the chief brought forth a gift that stole Tobias' breath. A ceremonial lance, adorned with eagle feathers and centuries of craftsmanship, its wood worn smooth by generations. "This belonged to my grandfather," the chief said, "and to his grandfather before him. It has never been given to an outsider until now." As the sun dipped behind the western peaks, painting the sky in fire and gold, the Apache prepared to leave. Yana's wound had been tended by the tribe's healer, and though he was still weak, he would live, and with him, the peace he had risked everything to protect. Before mounting his horse, Yana clasped Tobias' hand firmly. "You didn't just save my life today," he said. "You saved the treaty. You saved the peace." "I just gave a man water," Tobias replied. Yana smiled, eyes bright. "Sometimes that's all it takes to change everything." And just like that, 24 hours later, just as the story had promised, they were gone. But what they left behind was something rare, proof that in a world scarred by hatred, greed, and fear, simple decency still had power. Webb and Hawkins were convicted on all charges: treason, corruption, conspiracy to commit murder. The smuggling ring was dismantled, and the peace agreement not only held, but expanded, bringing every tribe in the territory under its protection. And Tobias Hartwell, a quiet man who never asked for any of it, became the first white settler ever adopted by the Apache Nation. Because in the unforgiving land of the Old West, the greatest victories weren't won with bullets, but with the bravery to see beyond bloodlines and the grace to meet an enemy with compassion. Now click the video on your screen for a story even more powerful than this one, with a twist that'll stay with you long after the last frame fades. Tap it now.